Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's show, we welcome back the incredible RICOstories with another exclusive to the DMT Forest to Fear channel. And as ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. Why, it really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story. Entitled Wind Walkers. Let's get straight into that. Epilogue. You can't kill what you don't believe in. Part 1. They came from the sky. It had been over 5 years since the Oak Ridge virus outbreak, and life had returned to normal for the most part, but there were still the occasional stories of livestock mutilations in the more remote areas over the past year or so. John Little Bear Stone's heifer was in labour, and he was up until 2 a.m. when the calf finally came. I was healthy and he planned to call the veterinarian first thing in the morning. He stayed up for another hour or so to make sure that everything was okay. All that remained was to dump the afterbirth a good distance from behind the barn. This would attract varmints, mostly coyotes, and it was a good idea to put it as far away from the barn as possible. He then got cleaned up and went to bed around 4 a.m, and he fell asleep almost instantly from exhaustion. It was hard for Patty to wake him up at 4:45 for any unusual sounds. She shook him, saying that there was something going on at the barn and to get up. An eerie, high-pitched sound was coming from behind the barn. He grabbed his shotgun and flashlight, fully expecting to encounter coyotes that would easily be scared off by a couple of rounds of buckshot. And as he exited the front door, he could now hear his heifer in distress and pounding sounds at the barn. And as he shined his light on the barn, his eyes flew wide open in terror. On the roof were several winged humanoid creatures about 5 to 6 feet tall. He started firing his shotgun until empty when a few of the creatures swarmed him. Patty heard his screams and immediately jumped into his big 4-wheel drive truck and raced towards them with the spotlights on and the horn blaring. As the sun broke over the trees, 5 local college geology students were exploring a cave system that straddled the Tennessee-North Carolina border. They began discovering bones of various sizes strewn upon the cave floor. And as they ventured deeper, they found recently killed carcasses of small animals, some with entrails still exposed. The girls, Susan Smith and Veronica James, became frightened and wanted to turn back. Patrick Andrews, their expedition leader, said not to worry, and that this was the work of coyotes, and that they were long gone. And they continued deeper into the cave, and now had their headlamps on, as their last rays of sunlight could no longer reach them. About 45 minutes into their trek, they all froze in horror at the sight of a small human decayed corpse. It appeared to be the body of a little boy about 8 or 10 years old. Susan and Veronica ran screaming out of the cave as the boys gagged, but apparently the girl's screams had attracted something else in the cave, as a high-pitched screech began, followed by what could only be described as the swooshing sound of wings. And within seconds, the boys were covered by nightmarish-looking human bat creatures with pale grey skin and dark sunken eyes. They used their picks to try and fight off these abominations as they backpedaled and ran. Andrew had managed to fight off the one that had him pinned against the cave wall by sinking his pick into his chest. He got on his feet and began throwing rocks at another long enough to allow Bobby Jones to spike it with his pick. But it was too late for Calvin Gordon. He cried out for help as 2 abominations had him as they flew down the tunnel with his feet dragging the ground. And as more creatures approached, they shined their spotlights, blinding them long enough to run for their lives. When they emerged from the cave, Susan and Veronica were on their cell phones with 911. Part 2. Tortured Souls. It was daylight by the time the sheriff and EMTs arrived at a rural Stone residence. Patty was frantic as she tried to relate the events. John was in the living room, covered in scratches and with some large gashes bandaged. He was wild-eyed and all he could say was, "Wind walkers, wind walkers." Sheriff Weaver tried to calm Paddy long enough to get a statement from her. She told of waking up Little Bear to a screeching sound, and then hearing his screams as he fired his shotgun. Then the sheriff couldn't believe his ears as Paddy told him she saw John on the ground with several large, two-legged bats attacking him. She said that if it weren't for the truck's bright lights and loud horn, they would have killed him. It was then that Deputy Ralph Fitz arrived. The sheriff met him at the door and said, "Let's check out the barn." And as they entered the barn, they witnessed a sight that would stick with them for the rest of their lives. The heifer was barely standing near the body of the newborn calf. She had large gashes exposing organs and ribs, and as they approached her, she collapsed onto the ground with laboured breathing. Now in full sight was the mutilated body of the calf. It was skinned and with large open wounds where the heart, lungs and liver used to be. They fought back the urge to vomit and turned away. They immediately exited the barn, and Sheriff Weaver called game and fish. Andrew and Bobby, they were cut up and bleeding as they tried to describe what had happened. They ran from the cave to the parking area in the safety of Andrew's SUV to wait on the first responders. Sheriff Weaver heard the call and told his deputy to remain outside the barn until game and fish arrived. He then ran to his patrol vehicle and sped to the cave site. About 20 minutes later, the sheriff arrived to find that Fire and Rescue was there along with the park ranger to greet him. And Ranger Gloria Albert said, "Sheriff, looks like you're having a busy day." And Sheriff Weaver gruffly responded with, "Yep, too damn busy for my liking. What we got here?" She shared the events as told to her by the college students. When she got to the part about the bat creatures, his eyes flew wide. Gloria said, "You okay, Sheriff?" He gathered himself and then spat out his large chew of tobacco and said, "Let's go talk to them kids." As he listened to the accounts of what had happened, Andrew said that their friend Calvin was small and around 5'5", 140 pounds, and two monsters had flown off with him. Soon more vehicles started arriving as various search and rescue volunteers and a state trooper joined the effort. The sound of a helicopter was now audible in the distance while the group gathered at the cave entrance. Part 3. The Prophecy. Let's get straight into that. As the SAR group stood discussing a search and rescue mission, a black helicopter rolled in over them and landed in the adjacent field. Out came a woman dressed in a black BDUs, wearing dark sunglasses. She was followed by 4 others similarly attired, and trailing them was a man almost 7 feet tall, who immediately got everybody's attention. "Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Master Sergeant Tammy Martin. We are part of the SAR team out of Fort Bragg. We just happened to be in the area when we heard the radio traffic." And Sheriff Weaver introduced himself and said, "Thank you, but I think we got this covered." And Tammy responded, "Well, Sheriff, with all due respect, sir, I don't think you know what you have here." The sheriff bristled as Tammy asked him and Ranger Albert to step away from the crowd. And she explained that there might be some remaining contaminants here from the big virus outbreak at Oak Ridge about 5 years ago, and that this cave would have to be quarantined until a hazmat team arrived to clear it. The sheriff responded, "There's a teenage boy in that cave, along with the body of what may be a 10-year-old boy, missing for over a week. We are going in." Tammy explained that she could allow the sheriff and the ranger only to accompany them, but everybody else had to stay outside, as we could not afford to have another virus spread. The sheriff reluctantly agreed, and she gave him and the ranger a respirator mask with goggles. She then asked the kids who had entered the cave and the EMTs who were treating them to separate from the others until the hazmat team had arrived. Back at the Stone residence, another helicopter had landed, but this one carried the familiar face of Chuck Wolf and his team, accompanied by Jamal. Chuck introduced himself to Deputy Fitz and advised him about the possibility of another virus outbreak. He then asked to talk with John and Paddy, and Chuck greeted Little Bear by saying, "Osoyo Oginali," or Cherokee for "Hello, my friend." John was still in shock, but Paddy responded with Olahisidi, welcome. As Little Bear calmed down a bit, Chuck asked him to describe what he had seen. Without hesitation, John responded with Windwalkers. Deputy Fitz gave Chuck a bewildered look, and Chuck explained that a Windwalker was a type of Wendigo with wings. The deputy shook his head in disbelief, and Chuck advised everybody to stay put until a hazmat team had arrived, while he and his team checked out the barn. As they entered the barn, they observed the now dead heifer lying next to the calf, and Sergeant and Nix had to hold back tears at this sight. And Sergeant Jones cursed and said, "What kind of an evil son of bitches did this?" And Chuck responded, "Ones that we will no doubt be on the hunt for very soon." Deputy Fitz called out for Chuck to come back to the house. Paddy had drawn a sketch of what she had seen, and Chuck now shook his head as he looked at the drawing of a cross between a man and a bat. Part 4. Legend versus Science. Chuck reported the events to Harry at Joint Team Chimera HQ. He sent a picture of the sketch and asked if Akimi could research this. Harry relayed some of the other reports along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. Chuck advised Hawk about a 10-year-old boy named Timmy Burton, who had gone missing from a park near the Smokies about 8 days prior, and that search efforts were still ongoing. But nobody was searching that far south. Chuck said that based on the eyewitness sketch, it looked like what they were dealing with was a large humanoid bats. At that moment, Game Warden Dan Al Griffin arrived at the Stone residence as Chuck and team were about to depart. The ranger saw the sketch and asked Chuck if they were aware of what they were dealing with. And Chuck replied, "A Windwalker," and gave a sheepish smile. Dan replied, "And that's what the elders think, but based on what happened in that barn, we better find out and stop it." And Chuck went on to say that he currently had a team that was about to enter a cave 15 miles to the north and needed to head up there. And Dan asked, where did they find the giant? And Chuck smiled and said that they had started recruiting agents from the NBA and headed back to the helicopter. Now Kimmy called Harry with a theory. She said, "What if we didn't get all the infected people from Oak Ridge? What if they escaped into the caves and fed on small animals? What if they ate rats and bats, drank their blood? Or maybe the virus mutated and they evolved into what they are now. This could be a serious problem that will have to be eradicated." And Harry asked her to keep researching, and she said, "Harry, you know we need a specimen." And Harry paused and said, "Roger that." As Tammy and her team ready to enter the cave, Sheriff Weaver looked at Eric and asked if they were getting agents from the NFL draft. And Tammy responded, "Oh, he's our secret weapon." Her cell rang with a call from Harry. "Good morning, Hawk," she responded. He briefed her on Akimi's theory and told her their primary task was to recover any bodies and take a specimen, preferably alive. And she said, "Roger that, sir," and sent Corporal Finch to the chopper for a net. As they penetrated the cave, Tammy advised the sheriff and the ranger to stay back, and then said something to the state trooper that made the whole crowd raise their eyebrows. And she said, "Boys, if anything other than us tries to come out of that cave, kill it." And you could hear a pin drop as they moved into the mouth of the cave. Tammy keyed her mic and said, "Wolf 1-1, this is Wolf 2-1, about to enter the cave." Chuck responded with, "Roger, 2-1, ETA 15. Part 5. Dark Places. The cave didn't look so creepy until the sunlight faded and the passage began to narrow. Suddenly, it was completely dark, except for the headlamps. They reached the location of the little boy and placed the remains in a body bag. As they pushed on with Eric at point, he pumped his fist and motioned for everybody to take a knee. He stated, "My ears detect a chorus of unnatural breathing and slight movements." And Tammy asked him to begin calling out to Calvin Gordon in a low but resonating tone. "Hello, young Calvin, are you well?" said Eric. Only the echo was heard, and they moved ahead another 100 meters where Eric repeated the process. but this time Eric cupped his hand to his ear and said, "Shh, a different sound, I think." He advanced another 30 meters and called out, "Calvin, if you can hear my voice, respond in a low tone." Eric gave a thumbs up and motioned for the team to follow, now using their red lights and NOGs. About another 20 meters, and Eric gave an abrupt sign to halt, and as their eyes adjusted, they saw dozens of masses lying around them. The creatures had rolled themselves into a tight ball and wrapped their bodies with their wings. Eric called out softly, "Young Calvin, are you able to move?" A low response of "No" was heard. "I'm in a pit, surrounded and covered by these things." And Eric responded, "Have courage, lad, and breathe deeply so I can locate you." Eric began to listen for Calvin's rhythmic breathing and pointed down and to the left at 2 o'clock. The team now witnessed this surreal sight as they ready to move forward, and Eric whispered over his shoulder to Tammy that he would jump into the pit and retrieve Calvin while the team engaged their targets. He leapt about 10 feet over these creatures and into the small pit, where he landed. A chorus of muffled screeching began as many creatures started to awaken. The team deployed flares and flashbangs that blinded and deafened the creatures simultaneously. And Eric emerged from the pit with Calvin over his shoulder and yelled, "Fall back!" And the creatures sluggishly stumbled about as if they were confused, long enough for the team to open fire and kill several of them. Eric handed Calvin off to Corporal Finch and then took the net and proceeded to ensnare one of the creatures. And as he rolled it up and secured the net, he shouted, "Retreat!" And the team threw some more flares and flashbangs to cover their escape. As they reached the cave mouth, Chuck and his team had already moved everybody back. Eric and Jamal tightly wrapped their screeching prisoner, placing a large strap over its mouth, followed by a hood over its head, and they quickly threw it onto the helicopter for transport to Fort Bragg. Young Calvin relayed how that when they'd first penetrated the cave, it was early morning and the creatures seemed more alert. Apparently, as the sun rose higher, they became sluggish. Several bit and scratched him, but by the time they reached the larger cavern, they started to bed down. "You are very lucky to not be in the main course for dinner this evening," said Chuck. Part 6. Fire kills. Fire purifies. Let's get straight into that. Now, some preliminary tests were coming back on the captured creature. What they had was indeed a mutated version of the original virus, and there were also traces of bat and rodent DNA in the creatures. But there were signs that their genes and chromosomes had been irreparably altered. It was very possible that dozens or hundreds of the people presumed dead from the Oak Ridge incident were among these abominations. The sad part was that there just wasn't enough time to develop a treatment. Tragically, the humane option was obvious. At about 1400 hours, Ranger Dan met Chuck at the cave entrance, and he said the elders sent a message to Little Grey Wolf. "Udan Nagala said, fire and purification. That's the only way to destroy the Windwalkers." "Affirmative. But I just wonder how many of them still have some sort of humanity left." "Well, at this point, it's probably not enough to save," said Dan. "What is the probability that there are more than 2 entrances?" Chuck explained that there will be aerial assets in place monitoring the entire area by sunset, tasked with trying to determine if there were other cave openings. "Well, the good news," said Dan, "is that Little Bear Stone and Calvin Gordon were responding well to antibiotics, and their infection seemed to be in check. The bad news was that some cattle were found to be infected and had to be slaughtered." And Chuck nodded and said, "Very well. Let's get to work." Back at Bragg, Hawk and the remainder of the teams were having a video conference with Tim Ross to discuss the game plan. Akimi's satellite imagery had pinpointed a northern cave entrance to the south of the Smokies. The teams were quickly prepping in hopes of entering the caves before sunset. Tank would proceed to the southern entrance and join Chuck and Jamal with another 5-man team. Eric and Alex would breach the northern entrance with 2 teams, while Hawk would set up a command post there. Chuck would do the same at the southern entrance. The objective was to search for any survivors or remains as long as possible before sealing off the caves for good. They would also use flamethrowers to battle the creatures and then set seismic, thermite and high explosive charges to seal the cave. Harry and Chuck would remain outside the QRF to cover the entrance and eliminate any stragglers with drones and choppers overhead. A flight of F-16s was to launch after they penetrated the cave entrances, but they all knew there was one big problem. Cave systems were famous for having multiple openings hard to locate. This would be the first time all 4 Alphas and their teams worked together on a major mission. They had many new team members and now had the opportunity to prove their worth. Part 7. Wings and Teeth. At the southern entrance, the sun was sinking behind the trees as Tank and Jamal separated on either side of the cave and made their way with team members behind them. Tank and Jamal led the team further into the cave until Thor and Samson abruptly stopped. Jamal, in his usual fashion, proclaimed a famous sci-fi movie line and said, "I have a bad feeling about this." And they crept onwards with Team Tank to the left and Team Jamal to the right. Thor and Samson halted to a bristle as a sudden wave of screeching followed shortly by the swooshing sound of wings resonated throughout the cave as they faced a wall of pale grey bloodthirsty demons with sunken black eyes. And most of the bats were on foot, but a few flew over the crowd, attempting to get behind the team members. Those were gunned down promptly. The Alphas knelt and deployed the sonic weapon as the team fired their rifles. Many of the creatures in front covered their ears and stumbled about, making themselves easy targets, but their ranks were deep and many more advanced, seemingly less affected by the sonic waves, as both teams were now engaged in close-quarter combat. The team members were unnerved as they observed human bat-like faces and with rodent features. Some were female and some were very young, but there was one look that they all had, and that was a primal, savage look of desperate hunger. And as they attempted to rip and tear at the team, their worries about any remaining humanity were quickly forgotten. At the north entrance, the team slowly advanced with Eric and Alex walking point, shadowed by Abishai and Cujo. With team members spread left and right, they began finding the remains of small animals strewn about. Then the dogs made a low whimpering sound as they sniffed the air. And there, behind some rocks, were the remains of 2 humans. The dogs suddenly growled and lowered their heads as they looked down the tunnel, and within seconds the ear-piercing screeching was deafening as a mob of pitiful abominations charged them. Several creatures paused and pointed their noses up to sniff the air, and then turned their attention to Tammy and rushed her, knocking her to the ground as she fired on them. 3 now had her pinned down, ripping at her abdomen. Abishai first alerted and charged, and she began to scream, getting Eric's attention. Abishai tumbled one off of her, ripping out its throat. Eric kicked another, sending it through the air as Abishai pounced on it. The other stood up to hiss at him, and he made one swing with his large blue steel katana, severing it just above the waist. He rushed to Tammy and said, "My love, I fear that this was a fool's errand." And to their 4 o'clock position, Alex and Cujo battled a group of 5, easily taking them out in less than a minute. The rest of the team fired upon what seemed like a sea of the creatures, advancing, and finally Sergeant Foster screamed, "Fall back, for the torch!" as he started spraying the horde with flames. Part 8. Air to Air. About an hour after the assaults on the north and south entrances began, ISR reported about a dozen or more heat signatures pouring out of 2 openings, one to the east and one to the west. Wolf Drone broke west and Hawk Drone broke east, when both Chuck and Hawk came over comms telling them to get back to the main entrances ASAP. 2 Black Hawks with miniguns broke off heading for each entrance, along with 2 Apaches covering each of them. Upon arrival, the Apaches deployed high explosives and phosphorus rounds onto the cave openings to slow the flow, but many creatures were already out. At the west cave opening, creatures swarmed the hello as 2 or 3 creatures were decapitated by the rotors causing the Black Hawk to start vibrating violently and lose control.
Badger Actual, this is Anchor 2, going down hard.
The pilot managed to find a small clearing and hit the ground as the rotor blades spun up a plume of dirt and debris. The crew was injured, and as they slowly attempted to exit the helo, the creatures swarmed down upon them. The Apaches overhead were unable to fire any longer for fear of striking the crew. The Apache pilot announced,
Cannonball 3 and 4, danger close, wreckage overrun, unable to engage.
And from inside the crashed Black Hawk, a voice came over comms saying,
Cannonball, this is Anchor 2, bring the shit or we're done.
And Cannonball 3 responded with,
Huddle towards the middle, if possible. We'll deploy 30 Mike.
And rolled in firing a 30mm chain gun, and 2 bats headed for the trailing Apache, and the drone deployed a high-pitched sound weapon and spotlight, causing them to tumble to the ground. The F-16s were now vectored south and tasked with the sealing of the cave openings, and the flight leader monitored the radio traffic and keyed his mic saying,
Badger Actual, this is Sledgehammer. Lead, can you provide coordinates?
And ISR came back with,
Stand by, transmitting now.
The flight separated as 2 broke west and 2 broke east. At the same time, the Black Hawk to the east along with the Apaches were engaging multiple targets when 2 bats flew into the open doors of the Black Hawk, causing the crew to stop firing the miniguns and fight for their lives. The helo began to pitch violently to the left, then the right, as 2 more creatures attacked one of the Apaches in flight. Fortunately for the 2-man crew, the creatures were unable to damage the armored cockpit, but the Apache had to take evasive actions, leaving only the other one to track and fire on the creatures. Almost simultaneously, the drone rolled in and deployed the sonic weapon, followed by an intense spotlight to blind and confuse the creatures. Some were no longer able to fly and hit the ground hard, and the drone, along with the Apaches, opened fire and eliminated the remaining bats. The Black Hawk, with 2 creatures on board, landed hard, but with minimal damage, and the crew, they kicked 2 dead bats out of the doors. Part 9. Strong Medicine. Let's get straight into that. Now both Hawk and Chuck, along with a small QRF, were picking off a few bat creatures that managed to escape out of their respective entrances. Each team was busy setting their explosives as they fought off the remaining creatures. Combat medics were now on the crash scene to tend to the injured as the Apaches orbited overhead, taking out the remaining bats. The Black Hawk that had made the hard landing with the creatures on board suffered minor damage, but 1 crew member had major bites and lacerations. The comms came alive with,
Sledgehammer 1 and 2 on station. Clear the area.
Followed by,
Sledgehammer 3 and 4 on station. Standing by.
And the combat medic crew announced,
Archangel has Arrow crew and egressing.
Followed by,
Arrow 2 out of the blast zone.
Chuck keyed his mic and said,
Sledgehammer, this is Badger 1. Bring the heat. Sledgehammer, roger.
Was heard as the F-16s rolled in and dropped their ordnance. A Jamal tank emerged from the cave, carrying 2 members with serious wounds and 2 more with minor wounds emerged on foot. The awaiting medevac crew promptly loaded them onto the helo for the hop to the hospital, and Chuck shouted, Pull back 100 meters, as everybody braced for the explosions. Chuck then pressed the remote detonator button, and 1 second later, the earth shook and the cave entrance disappeared. And to the north, Eric and Alex emerged, also carrying 2 seriously wounded, followed by others with minor scratches and bruises. The medevac helo there started up its rotor blades and it was off to hospital. And Hawk ordered everybody back 100 meters as he readied his remote.
Heads down,
he shouted and pressed the switch, and almost instantly the ground shook and the cave entrance imploded in on itself. Part 10. Good Medicine. At the debriefing, Tammy announced that this was indeed her last field mission and that she was returning to Tech Ops, and Sergeant Jones said,
Sarge, we thought you were a gunner when them critters swarmed you.
Well, about that, she said. I suppose they detected something that gave me a real scare. You see, I'm pregnant. The room fell silent as Eric spoke up. "It appears that these abominations smelled or sensed it. It gave me quite a scare." But the crowd was in silence as Tammy went on. "It's true. Eric and I are going to get married and have a baby." Hawk said, "Oh Lord, I'm not sure the world is ready for another walking encyclopedia." And as laughter erupted, the team members began to congratulate the expectant couple. The Alpha teams have proved themselves an effective defense against cryptids and chimeras and monsters. Epilogue. Hope rests upon the next generation. Wow. Wow. Certainly another one. Wow. As has come to be expected from a Rico story. Absolutely chest-pounding, intense and wholly refreshing. Big thank you, Rico, for allowing me to narrate this incredible work. You already know I appreciate it very much, and I just hope that you're enjoying this process as much as I. Well, guys and girls as ever, you know the drill. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help build the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. If you're an aspiring writer or would just like to get in touch, then please do so at the contact email, which is, as on screen, contactthedeadone@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. I hope you all had a fantastic week at work or school, or perhaps you're a long-distance driver. Whatever it is that you do, I hope you're enjoying it and are giving it your all. But above all, guys, remember, be safe, not sorry.